The bathroom light hums, the mirror holds two faces that will never agree, and somewhere a projector clicks like a nervous heartbeat. In 1960, a young man stepped into a shabby roadside motel and into history, his smile thin as a blade, his gaze soft as apology. The world met Norman Bates. Applause followed the terror, interviews followed the screams, and a gentle voice became the sound of unease for a generation. But behind the curtain call, there was a quieter role he never stopped rehearsing. A life lived in careful edits, in strategic shadows, in doors left barely ajar. Anthony Perkins learned early that fame could illuminate and interrogate in the same breath. He wore charm like a well-pressed suit and secrecy like a second skin. Friends called him graceful. Directors called him truthful. The camera called him unforgettable. Yet the questions that mattered most were never asked on set. What happens when the character the world adores begins to colonize the man who plays him? And what truths are forced into silence when an industry prefers a tidy narrative to a human one? Before Psycho, Anthony Perkins was Hollywood's promise of innocence. Tall, articulate, and shyly magnetic, he entered the industry in the 1,950 seconds when every studio searched for the next James Dean, a symbol of rebellion wrapped in vulnerability. Perkins, however, offered something different. There was a stillness in his eyes, a nervous tenderness that felt almost too real for the silver screen. He wasn't acting, he was revealing. Then came 1,960. Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense, saw in him what no one else dared to, not a hero, not a villain, but a mirror of human contradiction. In Psycho, Perkins became Norman Bates, the polite young motel keeper with a secret life stitched together by fear and guilt. The film shattered every rule: black and white violence, a murder mid-story, and a monster who looked heartbreakingly human. Perkins' performance was electric and terrifyingly sincere. The world called it genius. He called it just another role. But the role refused to end. Everywhere he went, people saw Norman, not Anthony. Reporters asked about horror. No one asked about happiness. Hitchcock moved on, but Perkins was left behind, trapped between applause and the echo of a scream that never quite stopped. Anthony Perkins was born into the glow of stage lights and the chill of expectation. His father, Osgood Perkins, was a respected Broadway actor whose early death left a silence the young boy could never fill. Shy, brilliant, and painfully self-aware, Anthony grew up watching the theater from behind curtains both literally and metaphorically. When Hollywood finally called, he answered with all the grace of someone desperate to belong. Friendly Persuasion, 1,956, earned him an Oscar nomination, and with it, the label of the sensitive new face of America. He was gentle where others were bold, vulnerable where others were cool. The studios loved him because he made audiences feel safe, but that safety was a disguise. Beneath the careful diction and polite charm, there lived a man afraid that any wrong move could expose everything he'd worked to hide. Fame, for Perkins, was not a celebration, it was surveillance. By the late 1,950 seconds, Hollywood's unspoken rule was clear. Charm is profitable, but difference is dangerous. Publicists arranged romances, photographers captured chemistry, and interviews rehearsed a life he didn't live. In private, Anthony sought authenticity where the world forbade it. He found love quietly, first in fleeting encounters, then in something deeper. Stephen Sondheim, Tab Hunter names whispered in the margins of a society allergic to truth. He once said, "I learned early to smile before I speak." That smile became armor. Yet every photo op, every interview, Every handshake deepened the split between the man and the mask. While Norman Bates terrified audiences by hiding a body, Anthony hid his own soul, and the applause only grew louder. The 1,970 seconds and 80 seconds brought a different kind of horror, one that didn't need a script. The world that once adored him turned colder as whispers spread. Roles became smaller, the spotlight dimmer. Then, quietly, came the diagnosis: AIDS. In an era of fear and stigma, even illness became a scandal. Perkins faced it the only way he knew: silently. He continued to work, directing Psycho 3, greeting fans, pretending normalcy as his body betrayed him. He refused pity, fame, or confession. "There are things better left between shadows," he once told a friend. For a man who'd lived his whole life performing composure, silence was the final act of control. On the 12th of September 1992, Anthony Perkins passed away at 59. The official announcement spoke of pneumonia. The truth, AIDS, was left unspoken. His wife, Barry Berenson, a photographer who adored him, honored that silence. Only years later did the world learn what had really happened, and almost a decade after his death, Barry herself was lost aboard American Airlines Flight 11 on the 11th of September 2001. Their love story, once secret, ended in twin tragedies, one in the body, one in the sky. Together they became a haunting symbol of fragility, of what happens when the world mistakes silence for shame. Anthony Perkins left behind more than a role. He left a reflection. Today, when audiences revisit Psycho, they see more than a murderer. They see a man split by expectation, by fear, by the cost of concealment. Younger generations, free to speak the truths, he couldn't recognize him as one of them. A pioneer of vulnerability in a time that punished it. His story is no longer one of horror, but of humanity. Norman Bates may have frightened the world, but Anthony Perkins taught it that monsters are often just men too afraid to be seen. In the end, the line between Norman Bates and Anthony Perkins blurred into a single, trembling shadow. Both men lived behind closed doors, one hiding from the law, the other from a world that feared honesty. For decades, Perkins was admired for embodying fear so perfectly on screen. Yet the greatest performance of his life was not filmed. It was the quiet choreography of surviving in secrecy. When the curtain finally fell, the applause faded into an unsettling stillness. Only then did people begin to ask what it must have cost him to live so carefully, smiling in interviews, rehearsing normalcy, loving in silence. His legacy is no longer about horror or scandal. It's about courage. The courage to exist in a time that demanded disguise. There's a tragic symmetry to it all. The man who gave the world its most famous scream chose to leave it in silence. But within that silence lies the real truth that the most terrifying prison isn't made of walls or knives, but of fear itself. Anthony Perkins will forever be remembered as the man who made us look at darkness and realize it was never about monsters. It was about being human. If this story touched you, take a moment to remember the quiet souls behind the loud applause, the ones who carried secrets heavier than fame itself. Anthony Perkins lived between light and shadow, between who he was and who he was allowed to be. In his silence, he spoke for countless others who feared to be seen. Tell us, what do you think his story reveals about the cost of hiding in plain sight? Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and help keep his legacy alive for those who still live between truth and fear. Because fame dazzles, but it also blinds. And sometimes, the brightest lights hide the deepest loneliness.